Yes, Kunstler, the wonderful lawyer for the guys, and I knew them. I had been at their, I got a call from Phil Oakes one morning in 1968 on St. Patty's Day, in the morning, like 7, 8 o'clock, and he said, you have to, I'm going to come and get you now. We're going down to the Ambassador Hotel, I think it was, because the Yippies are having their press conference. Nobody came. 2 people came from the press, you know, and the New York Times said, yikes, the Yippies. I mean, that was it. Nobody came. They weren't interested. But I went down and sang a few songs, you know, and they were all gathered, Dave Dellinger and all the gang. And then, of course, they were arrested, and they were charged with all kinds of things that they didn't really do. And, you know, they wanted to make love, not war. That was it. That's what they wanted to. And, of course, it was a disaster. It was a police state. And I think some of the people in the press got that, talked about it. But it was a terrible thing. Then they had to go to jail, and they had to testify at this trial. And Kunstler called and said, would you come and say a few words? And I did. And we had talked about it before, and the judge said, Judge Hoffman said, so you went to the founding meeting of the Yippies, and what happened? And I said, well, I sang, and I started to sing, where have all the flowers gone? And the court clerk came to me behind me and put his hand over my mouth. The function of memory is interesting. Mr. Fox was talking about the function of memory. I remember that very distinctly, but I remember nothing else after that. I was in such shock. He stopped me singing, and then it was only when the internet arrived on my desk that I saw that I talked on and on after that. You know, because then Kunstler said, well, couldn't she say the words to the song? There ought to be no singing in our courtyard, in our court today. And I did speak, and we spoke about it. But it had completely disappeared from my mind because it was out of an out-of-body experience. But, of course, those guys, I had such, I adored them all. But also, Dave Dellinger was an old soldier. You know, he'd been a conscientious objector, and he'd gone to jail in the Second World War. He was a scholar. He had such dignity and such, I thought, charisma and courage. And when he wrote his last book, he was teaching up in Vermont the last time I saw him, and he wrote his last book, and he dedicated it to the veterans of Vietnam War, those who fought it and those who fought against it.
Yeah, at that trial, more than one of the defendants, I believe, was bound and gagged.
Oh, yes. Well, Bobby Seals,
yeah.
It was 8 originally, which I'm sure you all remember. It was 8, the Chicago 8, but they made such a scene over Bobby Seals and refused to let him talk and tied him to his chair. And finally, he did request and was granted a separate trial. But and eventually, way down the road, of course, they were released. All of the charges were dropped, and they never had to. But it was a terrible thing on some level, and yet, of course, it was kind of, in a way, it pointed out what happened at that Chicago convention, which was the peace process, the anti-war movement was choked into silence in some way.